I promise I'll try to make it interesting and intriguing. So my first job is to stop this endlessly scrolling. Here we go. Perfect. All right, excellent. So what I would like to do today is about time, but time from the perspective of biology. And so the title of my talk is called The Dimensions of Biological Time. And biological time is interesting because you hear about it all the time, no pun intended. In fact, in putting together this talk, I was kind of cruising around the internet looking for kind of what's some interesting news stories out there on biological time. And the first thing I ran into is www.humanlongevity.com. Okay, and what humanlongevity.com basically promises that if you buy into their program, it will offer you extended human lifespan. Their goal is to extend and enhance the healthy, high-performance lifespan and change the face of aging. Okay. And what I will tell you, and based on your laughter, this is a little far-fetched. Okay. So what's the nature of biological time? So biology is amazing. Life operates at over 21 orders of magnitude in scale, from the subcellular all the way up to the biosphere. That's more time scales and spatial scales than the basic laws of physics operate over. 21 orders of magnitude of biological processes. So what about life? Okay, from the microbes. Microbes are pretty interesting. If you follow the fate of a microbe, it has a lifespan of minutes to hours. Let's compare that to a mayfly, about a day. Typical ant, a drone, maybe 3 weeks. You know, you probably have a few of these guys in your house. About a year. One of my favorites. Only fortunately about 8 to 12 years. Get up to the bowhead whale, gosh, 211 years. Now, some of my personal favorites, the General Sherman tree in California, 2,500 years old. But the crown winner of any single organism, in fact, both the largest and the oldest organism that have ever lived on Earth are alive today. This is the Great Basin bristlecone pine. They've been dated to 5,065 years old. This is the oldest known living non-clonal organism. It's interesting, clonality actually gives you kind of a burst in longevity. Clonal organisms tend to live, gosh, there's been some reported clonal organisms such as even a creosote bush, some aspen clones, up to 10,000, maybe even more years old. What about us? So the oldest recorded human was Jean Clement in France, lived 122 years old. She actually smoked every day, drank port, rode her bike up until I think age 102. So, time. So our notion of time is that of a clock, always ticking, always progressing. Time passes at a constant rate. In fact, this notion of time is so ingrained in us that we don't even think about time because it just slowly passes. And we can map everything that we observe on the natural world in terms of time. So here's the geologic time chart. And you probably, if you went to some of the earlier talks, you heard a lot about geologic time and the immense time of the universe. So the immense time of the universe is really unfathomable. It's hard to imagine what 1,000,000 years is, what 1,000,000,000 years is, let alone what life would be like over 120 years. Now we can map biological entities and processes on the standard progression of geologic time. And so you're probably familiar with the age of the Earth, approximately 4.8 or so billion years old. And then since then, life originated about 3.5 billion years. During the Precambrian time, that's what we call the Cambrian explosion, where most of the diversity of life first came about 541 million years ago. And so we can map this biological time on this steady progression of the geologic time chart. And so when you do that, you see a bunch of amazing things. So this is the tree of life, ranging from bacteria, fungi, echinoderms, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, all the way up to mammals. This is the tree of life. All organisms ultimately descend from one common ancestor, and we can trace then that temporal diversification of life on this steady ticking then of time. Now, what's interesting is that the explosion of life occurred in the Cambrian, but then was also shaped by a series of mass extinction events. And again, we can date these accurately. But that's trying to force this view of linear geologic time on the diversity of life. And so what I would like to do is stop that and really stretch your minds a little bit, because biological time is very different. In fact, it's relative. We perceive human time in terms of biologic time, but every organism on Earth perceives time differently. Biological time is relative. And to kind of give you an idea of that, you can kind of sit back and think about maybe going on a nice walk up in Mount Lemmon through the woods. Maybe you'll see a bird or an insect flutter by, but for the most part, those trees are just kind of sitting there, not really doing much, right? Well, what's interesting, what if we could take a forest and speed it up in terms of how the forest then would perceive human time? So what if we take, say, 2 years in a forest and compress it down to 60 seconds, which would be a relative merging of the scales of tree time with human time? What would we see? And so I actually ripped this from YouTube, but if you actually have a proper copyright, you can view this. This is a BBC documentary where they put together, after 2 years of filming the same forest in different locations, they pieced together 2 years of all these pictures along a transect, merged them together, and to give you a view of what that forest would be like on human time. So you'll see branches growing, leaves exploring the space, flowers coming in and out, mushrooms growing, a dynamic, active, moving landscape, right? Teeming with life. Biological time is relative. Okay? So when we go out and experience biology, we're seeing organisms that are experiencing time on completely different time scales. So we alter the temporal scale, slow biology appears to become alive. So, does biological time tick at a constant rate? No, it doesn't. Biological time ticks at different rates depending on the organism. Life's perception of time is different than geologic time. But biological time does have constants. And to do a firm understanding of what we mean by constants, we need to understand some basic concepts, in particular scaling. So understanding the dimensions of biological time requires 5 insights, for lack of a better word. So let's go through these 5 points, okay? So point number 1, I'm going to give you a scaling primer. And actually scaling, you already know how to do scaling because you probably were taught this in elementary school. But just a little bit of a background. Actually, does anyone know the first person who truly brought scaling into biology? It wasn't a rhetorical question. Right? I heard Darwin. Well, that's like, yeah, okay. So that's kind of like, if you don't know anything else in a biology class, just throw out Darwin, and you're usually right. In this case, you're wrong, right? Galileo. So Galileo was really interested why bones appear to be scaled differently. So in those two bones up there, which bone comes from the big animal? The bigger one, but notice how the bigger one is scaled a little different. It's a little thicker, right? Okay, and that's mainly because of biomechanics. If you're going to stand up and be a big animal, you have to scale your bones to have all that weight on those bones. So scaling, well, everyone knows that if you take a cube, its area is its length squared, right? So as we then increase the size of a cube or its length, okay, its area is then going to go as its square of the length. But as we increase that in size, notice that its volume is going to go as length cubed. This is the basics of scaling. This is known as Euclidean scaling. As you change the shapes of Euclidean objects, a cube, a sphere, a cylinder, we have equations to predict how area, volume change with the dimensions or the scale then of a Euclidean object. Okay, so a very quick scaling primer. And Galileo was the first one to introduce scaling to biology. So biological rates scale. So what do I mean by biological rates? One of the most insightful papers published was actually published by by a professor by the name of Max Kleiber in 1938. He was a professor at the University of California, Davis. He was an animal physiologist. And gosh, I would have loved to have met him. Look at that guy. He looks amazing. And so what Max discovered was that if you put different animals in in these really crude, early kind of chambers where you can measure the metabolic rates of these organisms, measure how much oxygen they were consuming, what he found was that if you put mice all the way up to elephants in these different chambers and estimate how much energy they were consuming, what you actually found was as you go from small things to large things, there was this very nice straight line on logarithmic axes. We call this a power function because we can describe it with a simple straight line on logarithmic axes. And this is also a fantastic plot because this is the only one that I know of where we actually have a man and a woman on the same graph at the same time. Right, nearby the sow and the chimpanzee and the goat, right? So, 1938. Now this actually set off a big firestorm in biology because Max argued that the slope of that relationship, the slope of that line was 3/4 or 3/4. Interesting, because biology at the time predicted that it shouldn't be 3/4. It should either be two things. It should be 1, the slope of 1. That is, if you double the size of the organism, you double the amount of food that you give to it. If you double the size of your dog, do you double the amount of dog food? Actually, no. You take your dog's weight and you raise it to the 3/4 power is how much food you should give it. But the other interesting thing was that we thought that biology should be like those cubes or those spheres like Galileo told us, that they should be like Euclidean objects, and that the metabolic rate should be proportional to your surface area, or you should scale with a slope of 2/3. Biology was right in the middle. And what's interesting is that it doesn't really matter what kind of organism you look at. Okay? You take some gentle beasts or amazing beasts or plants or insects or microbes, and if you look at the size of an organism versus the rate at which it's growing, if we have to correct for temperature a little bit here, but if we can plot insects, we can plot birds, plot fish, some plants, mammals, oh my goodness, a few protists, unicellular organisms, some zooplankton. We actually mathematically can't tell them apart from each other. They grow at the same scaled rate. They consume energy at about the same mass-corrected rate. And for chuckles and grins, a few years ago, we went out and we actually compiled our best estimates of how fast dinosaurs grow. I do work on plants, but occasionally I stray. There are dinosaurs. So the metabolic rate, we call it B, for lack of a better term. is proportional to the size of an organism raised to the 3/4 power. Now, how does this have to do with time? Just wait, I'm going to get to that in a minute. So it gets at time because if we plot the same relationship and we compare a shrew to an elephant, this is the size of an organism, and if we take its metabolic rate and we divide it by its mass, a small organism is fluxing energy at a much higher rate per unit mass than a big elephant. And you already knew that. Elephants are slow and lumbering. A mouse or a shrew, fast. Fast lifespan versus a slow life. So the power per unit mass actually decreases. There's an economy of scale within biology so that larger and larger organisms require less power per unit mass. They're more efficient, but they require more total energy. Heart rate. If you've ever picked up a hummingbird or even had the joy of holding a shrew in your hands, a shrew is basically vibrating in your hands. Its heart is beating at a rate of 600 heartbeats per minute. Compare that with yourself, okay, 70 beats per minute. A whale, 20 beats per minute, slowly ticking along. We can look inside your cells, we can look inside your DNA of different organisms, and we can ask, how fast do you accumulate mutations in your DNA? So we can follow populations of small organisms, follow populations of large organisms, and we find the same negative relationship. As you increase body size, the mutation rate decreases. Okay, the pace of life is slowing down. You're accumulating less genetic change per unit. Small organisms have a much higher rate of mutation. Now, biological time scale. So it's not only biological rates, the rate at which you're consuming food, the rate at which you're consuming energy, the rate at which you're accumulating mutations, your heart rate, but biological time scale. So this is a fun little graph, and I'm going to take just a little bit of time just to explain it. Biology falls along this fast-slow continuum, and biological time is warped. So what I'm showing you here is a compilation of results from birds across the world. And they're just, these lines are summarizing all of the data. And if we go down below here, these are body cycles of birds. The respiratory cycle, how fast the bird is breathing. The cardiac cycle, right? How fast the heart is beating. The fast muscle contraction rate. Small birds, a hummingbird can contract its muscles really, really fast, whereas larger and larger birds, once you get up to the size of a condor, their speed of contraction of muscles slows down, okay? But in general, so the contraction per unit mass slows down, but in general, as we increase in size, these body cycle times, the times then between neuron firing, how long it takes you to process energy increases. We move up in scale. These are physiological times. This is how fast it takes you to clear a drug then through the body. So if we were giving some sort of drug then to a bird, it would take a bigger bird longer then to pass then that drug then through its body. The circulation of blood, okay, takes much longer in a bigger bird. These are growth and reproductive times. Incubation time, how long it takes then a bird to incubate its little eggs, how fast it grows. Population doubling time. Okay, if you want to see that next big outbreak of birds, how long do you have to wait in years before you'll likely see the next population crash or boom? And up at the top is lifespan. Bigger birds live longer, little birds live a short life. So this is fun. Gestation time. How long does it take a mammal mom to ultimately give birth? Well, if you've noticed, if you've ever had mice in your garage, they reproduce at an amazing rate because it just takes on the order of, gosh, maybe a few weeks, okay, if not less, okay, for a litter of mice then to be born. Whereas us, we have a gestation time of about, what, 9 months, okay? But at the time you get up to an elephant, you're talking about gestation times, getting close to around a year. And what's interesting, if you actually measure then the metabolic rate of the developing fetus, then within mom, what you actually find is that developing fetus does not have a metabolic rate as you would expect for such a small little organism. Remember, this fetus is growing within mom. And what we find is that the fetus and the child growth, okay, within mom, its growth and metabolism scales as the metabolic rate of mom. It acts like a big organism within mom, but as soon then as birth takes place, at birth, baby's metabolic rate then changes immediately and is immediately scaled to the size then of the organism when it's born. So biological rates and biological times, okay, tend to scale with these exponents of either 3/4, 1/4, or so on. And so it's as if biological time is warped, depending on the organism that we look at. So here's Salvador Dali looking down on us, laughing at our predicament. So why is this? What's going on? Now, when we first started looking into all these various different numbers, the first thing that came to mind is, geez, this is just numerology in this phenomenological relationships. Are we just finding these numbers just because we're looking? Do they actually mean something? But if we look across all of life, we find then that biological times, okay, are warped. In that, if we look at scaling of processes associated with genes or cells or organisms and even ecosystems, we can describe then these processes with this simple power function, this simple mathematical relationship. And the exponent on this relationship here, or the slope on that log-log plot, is often a quarter power. Quarter, 3/4, 3/8, a 12, and so on. Now this suggests that deep down, maybe biological time is regulated. So the fourth point, what underlies variation in biological time? And I would like to introduce the term network. So this is actually something that I started working on when I was a graduate student and still continue to work on because the discoveries out of this has been just so, I find it remarkable, but they keep bringing up new insights. And so we started this work up at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. This is Jeffrey West. He's a high-energy physicist, and this is Jim Brown. He is an ecologist at the University of New Mexico. And the idea is that biological time ultimately is related to the networks that you see all around you. You, as you're sitting there falling asleep listening to me drone on, if I strip away your skin right there, you are a network. You're a network of blood vessels, you're a network of nerves, and you have an underlying cellular network as well. In fact, all organisms, if you strip away a lot of what they appear underneath, they have a network. And these networks are amazingly tree-like. So our first core assumption that we're going to start with is that a lot of these different biological scaling laws originate in the size and the geometry of hierarchical vascular networks. It's this tree shape that somehow has controlled a lot of biology that we see around us. And it's actually interesting. We can cut down a tropical tree, or I can rip your lung out. And if I measure that network mathematically, even though they're different and they do different things physiologically, those networks are actually mathematically the same. Coincidence? Maybe not. It was actually Leonardo da Vinci, in his quest to draw the perfect tree, discovered that you could draw any tree if you drew that tree according to one rule. And that one rule was area preserving branching. And it turns out we see this rule everywhere in biology. What area preserving branching is, so imagine a big tree. We can measure the cross-sectional area, that trunk of that tree. And if we climb up on that tree and go out to the tips then of that tree and calculate the cross-sectional area of all those tips of the branches at the top of the tree, and sum up all those areas of the tips, it equals the cross-sectional area of the branch of the tree. I'm sorry, the trunk of the tree. And that's Leonardo's rule. And he used that to draw his tree. So whenever you see a nice Leonardo da Vinci painting and there's a tree in there, you'd be like, hey, that guy used math and a simple rule to draw that tree. So why quarter powers? Why 3/4 and why 1/4? Well, first hypothesis is that ultimately cellular metabolism is going to be controlling the pace of biology at all scales. Ultimately up to the scale of the biosphere, how the biosphere itself is regulating itself through the flux of carbon and water and nutrients. So cellular metabolism is controlling the flux matter of energy through the biosphere, and it sets the pace and diversity of life. But what sets the pace of cellular metabolism? So for most organisms, we can boil the metabolism way down, and we can drill down into your body, okay, inside a cell, and the energetic powerhouse of the cell is this organelle known as the mitochondria. Within the mitochondria, there's a series of different cell membranes here, and you'll find probably the most conserved protein on the planet, known as cytochrome oxidase. This ultimately sets the pace and the speed then of basic respiration or metabolism across most organisms on Earth. So ultimately, for mitochondria and cytochrome oxidase to be happy, they have to be supplied resources, in particular, in the case of us, oxygen. So how do we keep mitochondria and cytochrome oxidase happy? We have to supply enough oxygen. And that brings up an interesting problem within biology. How do you supply all of these cells to keep cytochrome oxidase happy, supplying you with your baseline energy to perform all your mental and physical tasks? Well, it's often good to think of good analogies, right? So we all hate traffic, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of us are in Tucson. But how would you design an optimal network? Now think of all these people that live in a city or any sort of sizable kind of infrastructure. How do you optimally satisfy the needs of people, but with a limited amount of resources? Does each house get its own superhighway? No, we have to spend frugally in order to do the best for the common good. But unfortunately, the side result is traffic. So, second hypothesis. These quarter power scaling relationships reflect the constraints of how organisms optimally supply resources through networks, a road distribution network, a transport network, to supply the metabolic machinery. Well, how does it do that? Well, I missed my chance. Darwin's the answer, right? So, very strong natural selection on biological transport networks to basically find the sweet spot. How do you get the most bang for the buck? How do you optimally supply your metabolic machinery at the lowest cost? So two constraints. You want to maximally supply resources from the environment to your metabolizing cells, but at the same time minimize the cost of resistance and the total transport time. Two principles. Apply that to all networks. How does an optimal network scale? So if the network is space-filling, it kind of goes everywhere, tries to supply all cells. The final branch of the network is kind of invariant of size. Biology doesn't really fiddle with the end parts of networks or variation in cell size too much, or even the size of its mitochondria. And so we're going to have these transportation distances minimized. What are the predictions? Well, the end result, as you increase in size, go from a small dog to a big dog, the total number of cells is directly proportional to the mass of the volume. You double the size of the dog, you double the number of cells you have to supply. But the network under these optimizing conditions can only supply mass to the 3/4 amount of resources, because remember, we have to both optimize the network in maximally supplying resources, but do it at the minimal cost. And the end result, if you can notice this difference, there's a difference between 3/4 and 1. The network can supply mass to the 3/4 amount of resources, but the total number of cells scales linearly. So as you increase in size, you have to slow down your metabolism. A big network, you need more time to deliver resources. So as a result, the demand of cells have to match the rate at which a network can deliver resources. So let's try to take, I know that was a lot of mumbo jumbo, right? Let me try to find an analogy that'll work. So biological networks control rates and times. This is the metabolic potential of a cell. Now, let's take that cell and place it in the middle of a large network. You're not going to go too fast, but now let's place that same cell in a network with few limits. That's a small organism. Because it's easy to supply resources. Now, what's fun is that you can do experiments in biology. So here's that same graph I showed you with the size of an organism and the metabolic rate, okay, how fast your mitochondria are fluxing resources. In a small organism, the metabolism per cell really fast, okay? That sports car. As you increase in size, you slow down your metabolism. See this line right here and these cells? These are cells taken from different sized organisms and grown in petri dishes. What's the first thing that they do? Take that Ferrari outside of the traffic in New York and man, they crank up, okay? And what's actually interesting is that if I plotted cancer cells on here, do you know where cancer cells are? That same line. Cancer cells are cells that forget that they're part of a network, that they have to obey the rules that everybody else has to obey and tone their metabolic rate down. That's why tumors grow inside of you, because their metabolism skyrockets. So a shrew is basically a living tumor. It's a bad biology joke, I'm sorry, okay? So it's a cell free of the network. So this is consistent with the predictions that the constraints of the network limits the metabolic potential of cells. Okay, last point. I tried to boil this down, but it got a little long. Variation and scaling of biological rates and times are also constrained by the constraints, or constants, I should say, constants of life. And variation in the scaling of biological rates and times is described also by deeper constants of life. So one of the joys of being a professor is that I get to work with amazing students. So this is Ben Blonder. He came into my office and he said that he was really interested in leaves. I said, oh, I got a great project that we could work on. Leaves are really cool and they vary a lot. And you probably don't pay too much attention to them because they're all over the place, but we pay attention to them and they're really diverse. And what's really interesting is that I've been talking a lot about mammals, birds, and a few other crazy organisms. Well, all those different relationships that we see within mammals or other organisms, I can just look at leaves and we can see very similar things going on. And a leaf is a fundamental metabolic unit. And it's actually critically important. We're all worried about climate change. CO2 is in the atmosphere. Do you know the only thing that can take all that CO2 out of the atmosphere that's living? This. Okay. This is ultimately what regulates how much CO2, in addition to a lot of like rocks and continental movements, but that's geology. This is biology. A leaf dominates the carbon, water, and nutrient flux of terrestrial ecosystems. But what's interesting is that a leaf, if you strip it away from that green stuff, is a beautiful network. The network and its traits that we measure are home to match the local environment. So when you image these leaves, and this is actually some imaging we did in the lab, and so Ben produced these amazing movies. Okay, a leaf is a network. You think of it as a nice green thing, but it's really a network, just like you. We go out and we collect these networks, and we collect these networks in different environments. I say networks, but you call them leaves. And we measure these networks because they tell us how these leaves function in different environments. I can take that leaf, and I can tell you the temperature of the environment that it grows in by only measuring its network. I can take that leaf and I can tell you a lot more about that environment because that network is honed for that environment. So our goal is ultimately to predict how climate influences variation in diversity, plant faster, slow ecosystems, flux carbon dioxide, and measuring these leaf networks. I'm not going to tell you about this work, parts from some of the science that we're departing and working in Peru. Here's an example, Peruvian leaf vein network diversity. All leaves look the same, kind of, but actually if you strip them away of all that green stuff, they're incredibly diverse. So we take these images, we clean them up in the computer, and then we analyze them in the computer, and then we can do amazing things like create this. And you're thinking that I'm going to do great science with this, but no, we just wanted to create some great art that we can put on the wall. And it's cool, look at that, that's a leaf. Okay. All leaves are described by something known as the leaf economic spectrum. What is the leaf economic spectrum? Okay, so I've been just telling you about animals, so let's think about leaves. The same principle, fast, slow. Some leaves are very fast, other leaves are very slow. It's this continuum of time. So we can think of how much carbon it costs to create a leaf. Some leaves are very cheap to make, other leaves cost a lot. In fact, leaf lifespan spans from leaves that last, gosh, maybe just a few days. Some of our desert annuals here only last a little bit of time. The longest leaves, we're still actually discovering who's the longest lived leaf because people haven't really started noticing this. But I can tell you that there are many species that have leaves that last 3, 10, 25, maybe even up to 30 years. A single leaf. Maybe even longer. We don't know. We haven't really watched leaves for that long. But all of leaf diversity is characterized by this general global economic spectrum. Some leaves can cost a lot of carbon to make, and as a result, the return rate, how much time it takes to return the carbon it costs to create that leaf, lasts a long time. So if you're going to create a really expensive leaf, it better live a long time to pay back all that carbon it took to create the leaf. And as a result, it lives a long time. Other leaves are cheap to make. They're thrown out there really quick. They don't cost a lot of carbon. As a result, they actually flux carbon and energy at fast rates, and because of which they have short lifespans. High carbon cost, long life, low carbon return rate versus a low carbon cost, short life, high carbon return rate. And so this is for the physiologists in the audience. And I know there's a lot of you. If we plot the leaf lifespan, how much carbon it's taking in, the rate of photosynthesis, how fast the leaf is taking in carbon dioxide from photosynthesis, how much carbon it costs to make that leaf, how much nitrogen is invested in the leaf. Because remember, this is why you fertilize your plants, nitrogen. Nitrogen is ultimately responsible for how much photosynthesis the leaf is doing. Across all leaves on the globe, they're described by these trade-offs. We have slow leaves, we have fast leaves. And if we look at their networks, I can tell you whether or not a leaf is fast or slow based on its network. So the leaves on this side are designed to flux water nutrients and carbon very quickly. Leaves on this side are designed to flux carbon, water, and nutrients very slowly. Live fast, die young. Slow and steady wins the race. Okay? We can see these same analogies within biology. But this is what's remarkable. We can study leaves in Arizona. I can study leaves in the rainforests of Peru. I can study leaves anywhere on the planet. And what I'll find, if I calculate how much carbon a leaf will take in during its entire lifespan, and I look at how much carbon it costs to make and maintain that leaf, what you'll find is that on average for every leaf on the globe, approximately 4 grams of carbon are assimilated per 1 gram of carbon that's invested in a leaf everywhere. Short leaf, at the end of its lifespan, takes in about the same amount of carbon at the end of its life as a leaf that lives a very long time and lives a very long, slow life. In the end, they're all fluxing energy at the same overall lifetime rate. But it's not just leaves that do this. Let's go back to animals. And if I calculated for a given mammal, from a shrew to a mouse to a cow to you to the blue whale, they all have the same number, approximately, heartbeats in their total lifespan. It's about 1 billion. Use them wisely. Right? And for those quantitative-minded, there's some error in these numbers, so I'm sure everybody here is going to be fine, right? But on average, any mammal has about 1 billion heartbeats. And if I look at across all of life, the energy of life is actually constant across scale. The total amount of energy flux per unit mass is about the same. If I take that mouse and calculate how much energy is fluxed per unit mass over its entire lifespan, it works out to be about 8 times 10 to the 5th kilojoules per kilogram. Don't ask me where that number comes from. We have no idea. We literally have no idea why this is the case, but in general, this works out to be approximately true. You can compare a small mouse to a large whale, small annual to the general Sherman tree in California, and you get approximately the same number, about 8 times 10 to the 5th kilojoules per kilogram during the entire lifespan. It appears to be an energetic constant of life. So, does biological time tick at a constant rate? No, it doesn't. Biological time is warped, and it's relative to the organism then that experiences it. It ticks at the rate of metabolism, but can be modified by how organisms allocate to either a fast life or a slow life. But biological and we see those constants through scaling. So to summarize, understanding the dimensions of biological time requires, notice this is great, this is 4 insights, actually I had 5. That's great, yeah. It's called cutting and pasting from an earlier draft. So I gave you a scaling primer. I showed you how biological rates scale. Metabolism scales as mass to the 3/4. Biological time scale. Your heart rate, how long you live, gestation times, how long you're pregnant, right? How'd you like to be a pregnant elephant? Oh my goodness, you're talking about like, gosh, 9 months is worse. Think about adding many more. So biological time scale. We talked about networks and the importance of networks in terms of basically controlling the pace of metabolism. We talked about variation and scaling of biological rates in time are also constrained by these constants of life. So what drives variation in biological time? Variation in the scaling of biological rates time controlled by the geometry of vascular networks that are remarkably similar and tree-like across all, if not, well, most, if not all of life. But also there are these mysterious universal constraints on the total amount of energy that can be fluxed per mass per lifespan. We don't understand what sets that. So to conclude, I'm sorry, but the Human Longevity Incorporation is going to have to get past this energetic constraint first, and it could very well be that about 100 is the upper limit of what we're built for. So with that, I'll say many thanks to quite a few collaborators, and I want to mention that even though I've shown a lot of pictures, I've tried to keep the theory and the math a little light, but there's a lot of math and theory underlying this. And I do want to mention that it's kind of theory-free, but there's a lot of theory now coming out of biology that's really exciting. And I've been inspired by many theoreticians and physicists with this work. Additional funding sources. So your funds through the National Science Foundation have supported a lot of this work. So thank you for your tax money for supporting science. And institutional support, the Santa Fe Institute. And with that, I will say thank you. And I have some leaves here. And if no one's leaving, what I can point out is that if you come up, I can show you how to tell them whether or not you have a fast or a slow leaf. And with that, I'll take any questions. So thank you.
Now, those of you that have been here with us before know that we do a question and answer session immediately after the talk. And so what I'm going to do is, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll pass the microphone over to you. Go ahead and ask your question and then pass the mic back. And let's see if we can stump Dr. Enquist.
Won't be hard.
You know, you said that every organism has a billion heartbeats, so does that mean we shouldn't exercise at all?
You know, don't applaud for that. No, I get that question and that's usually the first question that's asked. You know, the honest and the sincere answer is I don't know. But it does, well, we do know that there are other obviously other things that can dramatically cut short the number of heartbeats that you have in your lifetime. And it does appear to be that you need to hone your efficiency of metabolism, right? And so by having an efficient metabolism, that also, that's one of the assumptions I think that underlies that. And so if you, I mean, obviously exercising, you know, is probably a good way to do that. So.
You mentioned that you were doing some of the studies in Peru. How did you pick Peru versus any other place in the world?
Why Peru as far as why not anywhere else in the world? Well, believe it or not, I'm actually a plant physiologist, even though I spend considerable amount of time learning about the scaling and metabolism in mammals, mainly because the early insight of those early physiologists was very different than when anything was going on within botany. Unfortunately, botany tends to be rather descriptive, but that's changing really quickly. And so I took a lot of my initial insights from the early zoologists who did a lot of work on scaling. And we started applying this to plants and discovered that actually we're seeing a lot of similarities, if not the same thing. So why Peru? Well, ultimately, I want to be able to predict what the fate of the biosphere is on the scale of, say, the next 5, 10, 100, if not more years. And the only way we're going to do that is to develop quantitative biology to the point where we actually can start to predict, just like the weather does, tells you what to expect. And some of our only principles that we have are principles based on physiology and metabolism. And so the gradient in Peru is a wonderful, spectacular gradient because we go all the way from the lowland Amazon of Peru, all the way up the mountains of the Andes up to tree line. And what's nice about working in a tropical environment is that the temperature is basically the same all throughout the entire year. So it's a constant temperature at a given elevation. But as we go up in elevation, temperature changes. So it's a natural experiment so that we can actually control for variation in temperature, but also control for differences then in where we sample these plants. We're using this elevational gradient as a huge microcosm for a change in temperature. We want to understand how changes in temperature then influence then the functioning and the physiology of plants. And one way that we're doing that is that how we're looking at how leaves change. And probably the best thing that you can do if you want to predict then the temperature of the place that you're in is take all the leaves and measure a few different traits, including these networks. And I can tell you with a very high certainty not only the temperature of that environment, but the variability of temperature in that environment.
Yes, early on in your talk, on one of your graphs, and I forget the reasons, but the big birds live longer than the small birds.
Yes, yes.
Why do little dogs live longer than big dogs?
You know, what's great about biology is that there's always an exception. There's always an exception in it. And okay, so all right. And so so if the first question I get is about the exercise, the second question I get is what the hell's going on with the dogs, right? So yeah, big dogs, they don't live as long as the little ones. And so what we're thinking is that's human selection has basically taken a wolf and with very rapid selection, human selection, always taken either the smallest puppy or the smallest puppy or the smallest puppy or the biggest puppy or the biggest one. We've now diverged then the sizes then of dogs quite dramatically. So all dogs on the planet actually went through this huge radiation in sizes and behaviors and everything, all from human selection. Now, human selection is very different than natural selection. And I bet if you throw your little dog out in the wild, it's not going to last very long, right? Neither will the big dog. So that size difference, we can select on size, but it's a cheap selection on size because actually we're not selecting on the full life histories. That is to be able to survive and reproduce, in nature. So we give a lot of energetic input to dogs. We feed them, we coddle them. They're great, right? But normally they'd have to be foraging and expending energy on their own. And because of which, we've selected then on one size attribute, okay? But in the process of doing so, we have any sort of quick selection like that also brings along other problems like hip dysplasia and genetic inbreeding and things that tend to mess up all these other attributes. So the case of dogs, we're kind of thinking that it's effectively, yes, it's a kind of a cheap way of getting a small and a big thing, but you're really not also getting the full kind of component of a working physiology that would be functioning in the wild. Right?
Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm over here. I know you're.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. No, I appreciate you actually.
Right.
So the one thing that I know you didn't explicate on too much, but this is really a revolution, isn't it, in complexity and chaos theory that you're going for. It's not just categorization, it's actually taking mathematics and applying it to things like biological systems, like network theory. I know you kind of played that down, but from complexityexplorer.com, which I recommend to everyone, Google complexityexplorer.com, right? It is sort of a revolution. And from our days where we would look at samples in an Aristotelian fashion of this thing and that thing and that thing, could you speak to that?
Well, I'm humbled to hear you say that. Well, revolution, I don't know. I mean, that's not for, I think, me or others, here immediately to decide. I do find it insightful and does make a lot of predictions. And from that perspective, that's really exciting. I'm excited by that. And I think in the end of the day, if this proves to be useful, okay, to leads new insights and new discoveries and things, if it becomes a useful kind of part of biology, then that's great.
Over here.
Yes.
I have two questions, actually.
Yeah.
The first one is, what role does fractal geometry play in the network development? And the other one is, given we're in a period of climate change, will the biosphere metabolism change to adjust to that?
Okay, so two questions. Okay, the first question was, what's the role of fractals underlying this? And then the second one is having to do with climate change. Basically, can we use this to say something about climate change in terms of what will happen then to the biosphere into the future?
Will the metabolism of the biosphere change to counteract?
Yes, will the metabolism of the biosphere kind of change in some ways to counteract? What do you mean by counteract? I'm sorry. To compensate? Okay, so I'll take both great questions. Okay, so the first one's, on purpose, I didn't mention the F word, all right? Because when I mention fractals, that tends to have set off different connotations to people. Okay? So fractals actually underlie all of this. I tend not to like to talk about them in terms of fractals. Instead, we call them self-similar rules, which is another way of saying fractal, right? And all a fractal is basically taking a rule and iterating that rule over and over again across different scales. And you can think of these networks as following a fractal rule as basically saying, as you grow and then branch, follow the Da Vinci rule. As you grow and then branch, follow the Da Vinci rule, and repeat that rule ad infinitum, right? So these algorithmic rules, okay, in biology, you can create amazing structures by very simple rules. So all of these networks that we see in biology, you can create from just a few simple rules, such as the space filling rule and the Leonardo rule. That will give you effectively most of the diversity of networks that we see within biology. So yes, fractals are very important. Why fractals? Well, biology is very easy to utilize these fractal rules because biology is all about growth. Cells divide and grow, cells divide and grow. But if they follow the same rule over and over again, that's effectively a self-similar or fractal rule. Okay. So fractals, yes, very important. Now, the future of climate change, oh my goodness, whether or not metabolism will somehow self-regulate or what will happen to metabolism into the future. So there's a whole other component of this work that I didn't talk about. And so networks are of first order importance in terms of constraining how fast resources can be delivered then to metabolizing cells. But what is probably the next most important factor is temperature. And the temperature effect has an exponential effect. And so anything in biology, if you warm it up, it speeds up fast. If you cool it down, things slow down. It's one of the reasons why we have a refrigerator. You have a refrigerator because you're slowing down microbial growth, right? You take your food out of the, especially here in Arizona, you put your yogurt on the counter for maybe a day or two. Oh my goodness, you got something growing in there. You put it in the fridge, you slow it down. And those kinetic effects of temperature, they actually follow a very regular Boltzmann relationship with temperature. It's an exponential temperature relationship, and it's governed then by the activation energy, fundamental activation energy of metabolic enzymes. So what climate change is going to do is basically speed everything up. And this is the scary part of climate change. So as we start progressing, people don't fully understand the power of exponential growth. So as you start cranking up the temperature of the biosphere, things are going to start happening more and more quickly, which will then feed back to influence the pace of climate change. It's what we really worry about in climate change research, that the rate of change is just going to speed up and speed up and speed up so fast that it's going to surpass our human timescales in terms of what we normally respond to. That's what I'm worried about. Will metabolism equilibrate? What we've known kind of if we think about where all this carbon is coming from, all that carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere has ultimately come from plant metabolism. And plant metabolism scrubbed the atmosphere of all this CO2. So remember back in the days of the dinosaurs, remember back then, right? It was warm, the planet was warm, there's forests on the poles. The reason it was warm because there was a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Over time, plants scrubbed all of that CO2 out of the atmosphere, global temperatures have cooled. A lot of that carbon deposited in things of coal, methane, oil. We're putting it back. So if you want to experience Jurassic World, just wait another 100 years, okay? Because we're putting it back. Plants did us a favor over millions, hundreds of millions of years ago and scrubbed the atmosphere. So unfortunately, that's the world that we're going into.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, one from a gentleman over here, and then I've got one for you, Brian.
Sure.
Thank you. So this is a question that's probably maybe not even relevant to what you've been discussing, but you mentioned in passing perception of time, which is something I thought you were going to be dealing with in more detail. And I guess my question is, throughout human history, humans have tried to objectify units of time, and yet in the last 100, 150 years, psychology, beginning, I guess, with William James, has suggested that we perceive time differently than objectively. And I'm wondering if any of this ties in with your research on time.
You know, that's a fantastic question. It's actually, that comes up in the back of my head kind of repeatedly for a very long time. And I did want to try to touch on the perception of time a little bit in this talk, but I already knew that I had more than enough to talk about. The perception of time. What's interesting, when you're born, you start out really small, right? And then you get bigger. Gosh, when I think about, when I was little, I remember my mom wanted to start getting me to save some of my allowance. And she said, if you put away, like $1 a week, for like the next year, you'll have this much money, and then we'll add a little bit more, because of she was trying to teach me about compounding interest. What a great mom. And I remember thinking that, gosh, a year, that's so long. I'm like, there's no way. I mean, I remember getting visibly upset about, do you know how long a year is, to a 7-year-old? I mean, it's like asking, the child to wait, like 100 years. I mean, it was actually a little traumatic because, it's like, I'll never see that money, Now a year goes by like that. And I do wonder, if I plotted your metabolism on those plots, as you age, you follow that same line too. And so it's as if our perception of time is changing as we get older. I don't know if anyone's actually tried to measure that. It just seems right to me, though. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how, I guess, taking a biologist's point of view, how I perceive the perception of time. Yeah. I remember we used to have good friends in college that seemed to have just perceived things differently. Could pick out, events, that maybe I may skip, over, as if they're just perceiving things differently. I don't know. It'd be great to be able to measure that.
Hate to give a sneak preview, but next month's talk is, are you ready for this? The perception of time.
Maybe I should go to that.
Yes, actually, it's by Dr. Fabian Fernandez, and this is actually going to be the psychological approach to how we perceive time. So if you're interested in that, you might actually find your answers there. My question for you, Brian, what got you into biology?
What got me into biology? This sounds completely cliche and almost, because it does relate to what I just presented. I climbed a tree for the first time, and I thought it was so cool. I mean, really. I was like, this is a pretty cool thing that I'm sitting in. Yeah, so.
All right, well, let's have one more round of applause for Dr. Brian Enquist. And if you like what you see here, on March the 10th, Dr. Fabian Fernandez, who is a professor of psychology at the U of A, will be presenting.